I remember reading this book back when I was a kid in the late 1990s. Now that might seem a little bit strange since it was published in 1970. So for whatever reason, there was a copy at my grandparents' house, and I read it when we were visiting and I was bored. Anyway, the part that I've always remembered was this mysterious reference to the 1919 Stanley Cup Finals. You know, the truth is I don't really even know why my grandparents had that book. I mean, my grandfather didn't really care much for sports. I don't think that my uncles were really all that interested in ice hockey either. Anyway, I've always been curious about the Influenza Stanley Cup for my entire life, ever since I read that as a kid. It's sort of one of those strange things that a strange kid like me would be interested in. You know, this idea that there was no champion in the end and like nobody else knows about this. I've always thought that maybe it would be possible to do some sort of like replay project or something to figure out who really should have won the Stanley Cup that year. Well, maybe we could do it using a game like the old text-based app of hockey, right? I mean, it might not be the prettiest game to look at, but it's a lot of fun to coach an invisible team and manage those lines. And believe it or not, people in that community have actually made that season disc for the game. Or we could play with something like the NHL series. So some guy on the NHL 94 forums made a mod of that game for the 1910 National Hockey Association season. He even followed that up with 1911, which is the first year of the six-man hockey that we know and love today. Well, there's no 1919 season yet, at least that I know of, for NHL 94, but maybe something will come along eventually. Anyway, before you get really excited and you start going for replay projects, you do need to understand something. The sport of ice hockey itself was really a lot different back in 1919. If you had a time machine and went back to 1919, you really would have a hard time recognizing the sport. For one thing, rosters were smaller. These 8 men were the entire Seattle Metropolitans team, and the rules were a lot different. You see, it wasn't until November 1927 that forward passes were made legal in the NHL. Before then, the player you were passing to had to be behind the puck when the pass was made. And in the beginning, forward passes were only allowed in the defensive zone. When I first learned about this a few years ago, I came to the natural conclusion that ice hockey must have somehow evolved from rugby. In fact, I've also read where some other amateur historians have said something similar. But believe it or not, it's just not true. The two sports might have shared the backward pass, but they are otherwise unrelated. So big thanks to Ian Fife's excellent blog Hockey Historicis for providing the correct information on this one. Basically, the first hockey rules in 1877 were based on the field hockey rules from England, which in turn were based on the association football or soccer rules of the time. Those rules were completely different from the kind of scrum and other things you would see in old rugby. But if you want to be technical about it, rugby and association football were originally really two related variants of the same old English outdoor football games. Anyway, the important thing for this video is that hockey still had that backward pass rule in 1919. And the other thing that you might not know is that there were two different leagues, and they were both really, really small. The National Hockey League as we know it was established in November 1917 and was still pretty young by the time 1919 rolled around. To put this into perspective, this small chart is the entire schedule for the first NHL season, and you will notice that there were only 4 teams. A massive fire on January 2nd, 1918 burned down the old Westmount Arena in Montreal, which is where the Canadiens and Wanderers both played in those days. The insurance didn't even come close to covering the cost of rebuilding the arena. Now, the Canadiens were able to move over to the Jubilee Rink in Montreal, which had a little over 3,000 seats. The Montreal Wanderers, meanwhile, dropped out of the league entirely, and newspapers reported that the players had deserted the now bankrupt team anyway. And in keeping with the spirit of the times, the Toronto team sued the now non-existent Wanderers team for daring to fold. Those were certainly different times. In fact, the early years of professional hockey were filled with fighting and legal wrangles. I'm not talking about fighting on the ice, I'm talking about fighting between the owners of clubs. In fact, there's actually too much for me to go into if I want to keep this video a reasonable length. Anyway, the fun part comes when you look at the other league, the long-forgotten Pacific Coast Hockey Association. The old Pacific Coast Hockey Association was formed in 1911. This is back when the rival National Hockey Association was doing really poorly. There was a total of 3 teams to start out with. The PCHA expanded to the United States in 1914 when a team was placed in Portland. In fact, in 1916, the old Portland Rosebuds became the first U.S. team to play for the Stanley Cup, though the club folded not long after that. That league expanded again in 1915, sticking a team in Seattle, Washington called the Seattle Metropolitans, and the Metropolitans became the first non-Canadian team to win the Stanley Cup in 1917. Now, if you pay attention to those old newspaper articles, you will realize that these leagues were not exactly doing well financially. This was the middle of the Great War, of course, and there were small leagues playing in front of small crowds in small arenas for small money. But the newspapers went absolutely bonkers for the sport on both the East Coast and the West Coast. Now, all of the bickering among owners almost meant that the National Hockey League wouldn't even operate in 1918. It's confusing, but the NHA still technically was around, and the NHL season wasn't finalized until the NHA officially suspended its operations in early October 1918. I won't get too deep into the politics behind all of this, that's for another video. Basically though, the way to understand this is that the clubs operated individually and kind of had a choice between different leagues. And so you had clubs threatening to fold and clubs threatening to move to different leagues, and you had clubs threatening to move to different cities, all of this stuff happening at once. It's all very confusing, especially when you consider that the NHL only had 3 teams at the time anyway. In the end, the NHL started December 1918 with just 3 teams and played a season that was divided into 2 halves. The Montreal Canadiens won the first half of the season with a 7-3 record. Note that the record of the Ottawa and Toronto teams in this clipping will be different from what you see in your history books for whatever reason. The Toronto Arenas lost an overtime game on February 18, 1919 to the Ottawa Senators, which basically gave Ottawa the league title for the second half of the season. Now that game was played in front of only about 1,000 paying customers, and the Toronto team was really in financial trouble. The NHL season ended when Toronto officially withdrew from the NHL 2 days later, setting up a playoff between Montreal and Ottawa for the championship. Again, the crazy thing here is that the newspapers were absolutely fascinated with this sport and all of this drama, but the fans just weren't showing up, and the teams themselves seemed barely able to stay afloat financially. Anyway, with only 2 teams left, the NHL staged a best-of-7 series for the championship. Center Frank Nybor of Ottawa wound up missing the beginning of that championship series. Nybor was a key player for the Senators, or like it says in this headline, the Capitals. Nybor's sister had passed away suddenly in Detroit, and Frank wound up missing the first 3 games of the playoff series due to bereavement. Predictably, Ottawa struggled without its star player. Now, I know what you're thinking, this is 1919, right? So what about that Spanish flu? Is that possibly the reason that his sister died? So the official reason for her death was some kind of blood poisoning, but the pandemic was absolutely happening at the time, and it was impacting a lot of people. There were small articles at the time about the influenza, though it didn't generate the sort of headlines that we saw later with COVID. There were occasionally stories about the impact of influenza, such as this one from Nova Scotia that was published on February 13, 1919. For the most part, however, newspaper references to influenza, or the grip, mostly came in the form of advertisements for extremely questionable forms of medicine. Even headlines like this one from Windsor, Ontario were reserved for the back sections of the newspaper, so this article is from page 12. And so there really wasn't much of a concern among the professional hockey club about the influenza. You don't see any newspaper articles calling for professional sports to be completely abandoned because of the flu. Now, the things that we think of in retrospect really were not on people's minds at the time, and this is frightening since they were basically wandering blindly into a major health crisis. Anyway, Ottawa found itself down 3-0 with its significantly reduced squad. The Senators were able to compete somewhat with a 6-3 victory in Game 4. Nybor was back in the lineup for that game, and Ottawa's team played well. But the Canadiens won the 5th game 4-2 in front of a very disappointingly small home crowd. Now, the other strange thing here is that the Canadiens didn't play another home match for the rest of the playoffs, so the team played all of its Stanley Cup Finals games on the road. This seems to be because of some legal wrangling in the background, I think. There was a legal dispute over the ownership of the Jubilee rink throughout 1919. I'm not entirely certain to understand how it worked, but it seems that the Canadiens lost the ability to stay in the rink somewhere in the process. Anyway, in the end, the Jubilee rink was destroyed by a mysterious fire that April, and the Canadiens wound up playing in the Mount Royal Arena the next season. Anyway, whether that's the real reason why they didn't play in Montreal or not, I don't know. Now, was this fire an accidental fire? I don't know the answer to that. Naturally, I think you should suspect at least some foul play here because there was this massive legal dispute not long beforehand. But anyway, in the end, that's the way that things were in 1919. Meanwhile, the first place Vancouver Millionaires and second place Seattle Metropolitans played a 2-game series for the PCHA Championship. The series would be decided on goal difference, with the winning team meeting Montreal for the Stanley Cup in a 5-game series. Seattle won the first game at home 6-1. Vancouver won the second game 4-1, but that wasn't enough goals to overcome the deficit, and so Seattle went to the Stanley Cup Finals. And again, the plan was to play all 7 games in Seattle, which really does seem strange in hindsight. The Metropolitans played at the old Seattle Ice Arena, which wasn't exactly the biggest or best hockey facility in the world. The old Ice Arena only sat about 4,000 spectators and was eventually converted to a parking garage in 1924. So like I said, you can't look at the 1919 Stanley Cup Finals as if this were a normal series. This was a special series from a special time in the history of the sport. It's nothing like what we're used to today with all the glitz and the glamour and all that other stuff. Seattle won the first game 7-0, in part because it was played under the PCHA rules. See, back in those days, the PCHA did allow forward passes in the neutral zone and was still playing with 7 men on the ice. The old newspapers are a little bit vague on the issue, but the center ice rule referred to here is almost certainly that forward passing rule. And it's not that easy to dig through all of this stuff because the newspapers did not exactly take the time to explain the differences. Anyway, the odd-numbered games use the PCHA rules and the even-numbered games use the NHL rules up until Game 5. And yes, this really did make a difference. And so when the second game was played under NHL rules, Montreal won easily 4-2. Though Seattle mounted a late comeback, it was too little, too late, and Montreal wound up with the victory. And there was apparently a standing room only crowd at the arena. Seattle won the third game easily, 7-2, again under the PCHA rules. And that set things up for the fourth game, which was one of the most incredible games in the history of the Stanley Cup. And no, this series was not only about the influenza. The hockey played here was amazing and fascinating. There was a tremendous crowd on hand to see if the Mets could win the Stanley Cup. However, defense prevailed and period after period went by without a goal. Both teams had excellent power play opportunities, but neither could come close to scoring. In the end, the teams went through 60 minutes of regulation and 2 10-minute overtime periods without a single goal. The Seattle manager protested that there should have been a third period of overtime, but it didn't work and the players were too exhausted to play anyway. This was an extremely controversial ending to a great game. In fact, this was probably one of the greatest games in the entire history of the Stanley Cup. As you can imagine, it was also quite violent, with stars like Jack Walker for Seattle suffering serious injury. And everybody wondered what was going to come next. So that set the stage for the fifth game of the series. Now remember, Seattle could still win this thing with a victory, but Montreal was determined to stretch the series out just a little bit longer. Plus, this game was played according to the NHL rules, which gave Montreal an advantage. Seattle started out that fifth game with an all-out assault on the Montreal goal, scoring in the first 6 minutes. A few minutes later, Seattle added a second goal. Jack Walker then made it 3-0 early in the second period, and it looked like Seattle was going to win easily. But the Canadiens started to attack midway through the second period. Montreal came to life in the third period, scoring twice quickly in the first few minutes, and it was a dramatic goal with only about 4 minutes left that tied the score for Montreal. Finally, after 15 minutes of overtime, Jack McDonald scored the game-winning goal for Montreal, tying the series at 2 games each. This was a tremendous series, likely the greatest series in the history of the sport to that time. And everybody looked forward to the final game on April 1st, but of course that never happened. Gamblers started putting big money down on Seattle to win the series when it turned out that numerous Montreal players were sick. There were numerous reports of Montreal players who were down with an injury, something that later turned out to be the influenza. The crazy thing is that it looked like there was going to be a final game up until the last possible moment. These articles are from April 1st, the day it was supposed to happen. In the end, so many Montreal players were down with the flu that the series was postponed. It was reported that 2 Montreal stars had a fever of over 104, which shows you just how bad the influenza really was. And since the Seattle players were also pretty badly off, it seemed like the series would never resume. And sadly, it never did. In the end, 38-year-old Joe Hall of Montreal passed away from the flu. Hall's death on April 6th made it clear that the series simply could never continue. One of the most amazing series in the history of the sport thus came to a sudden and tragic end, and the series would forever be associated with Hall's untimely demise. And it's probably for the best in the end that the 1919 Stanley Cup Finals will remain tied forever. It seems like a fitting end to a series that really was absolutely fantastic. In a way, it kind of seems inappropriate to try to figure out a winner after the fact. Anyway, those were the real blood and guts days of hockey, back when the rosters were small and the game was fierce. We've seen a lot of improvements to the sport in the years since. The teams and the leagues have come and gone, but the legacy of those days remains. And the more that you research into what actually happened, the more fascinating this series really is. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Stick around and you'll get a couple more in-depth looks into some of the history of the sport and a bunch of stuff like this. I'll talk to you guys later.